Typically, Borderlands games have an incredibly long shelf life, so I feel it's important to state my initial verdict right away. From my perspective, Borderlands 4 is a solid entry. I think it feels just fresh enough while still being unmistakably more of Borderlands we know. Let me be clear, if you're not already a Borderlands person, I doubt this will be the game to completely blow you away, but I firmly believe it does enough new things to keep the formula interesting. Hi folks, Lily here from PlayGridz. Today, I want to talk about Borderlands 4, because the long-awaited return of this incredibly fun co-op looter-shooter franchise is finally here. I need you to keep in mind that this is all based on my first impressions since the game launched. The moment it became available, I dove right in, and I have to be honest, I've been playing it non-stop ever since. I believe I'm still not incredibly deep into the game, but I've played enough to have some strong upfront takes and initial thoughts on what you should expect. I honestly can't predict how the most hardcore, diehard Borderlands fan is going to react to all the changes. I consider myself more of a casual fan of the series. For me, the second game is still the peak. While I've played all of them, my initial gut feeling is that this new installment feels impressively fresh from the get-go. From what I've seen, it's a huge open world filled with a ton of quests that really pull you in, and it throws some incredibly cool guns at you right from the start. I also noticed some definite tweaks to the series' trademark humor and storytelling, which I'll get into in a bit. And of course, I have to mention that just like seemingly every other major AA release lately, it has its share of technical problems at launch. To really set the stage for you, my experience takes place on the new planet of Kairos, and I have to say it still feels very much like Borderlands. There are so many familiar elements that I immediately recognized, but it's also different enough that it doesn't feel like a retreat. To me, it feels like the developers are leaning much more heavily into the sci-fi aspects this time around. With this new setting, we also get 4 new Vault Hunters. First, my understanding is that there's Vex the Siren, who has the power to summon creatures, which lets you conjure and command things from a distance. Then there's Ammon, the Forgic Knight, who I see as the classic tank character. He can conjure unique weapons and specializes in melee combat with some pretty complex elemental stacking abilities. We also have Harlow, the Gravatar, who I've seen uses technology to manipulate and move enemies around the battlefield. Finally, there's Rafa, the Exo-Soldier, who I personally chose to play as. He can summon these awesome shoulder-mounted auto-targeting guns and is generally very quick on his feet. I went with Rafa and jumped straight into the action. The thing that struck me almost immediately about the presentation is that your chosen character seems to have much more agency this time around. From my perspective, they chime in with more quips and dialogue, but don't worry, I haven't found it to be annoying at all. What I think is really cool is that they now actually appear in the cutscenes, which is a great touch. I have to be honest, the entire introductory sequence, which serves as the tutorial section in the first area you explore, felt a bit weak to me and wasn't particularly thrilling. However, I will say that it at least does a decent job of setting up the game's main villain, the Timekeeper, who even after several hours of play, I still haven't quite figured out. I think he has a cool design and seems interesting, and for a lot of the early game, you're primarily dealing with his direct subordinates and lower tier commanders who seem to have a strong hold on this bizarre world. Now, let's talk about the shooting, which in my opinion is the absolute most important part of any Borderlands game, and I think it feels pretty damn great. The guns hook you in right from the very beginning. I was surprised by how early on I found some truly kick-ass weapons that had an immense amount of variation and creativity. I'm talking about weapons that felt like they could have been endgame loot. I really love that they did that. For me, it still has that classic Borderlands feeling where you get overwhelmed when a boss or even a sub-boss explodes like a piñata. Dropping tons of weapons of different colors, I find that it can be a lot to take in, but that process of sifting through the loot to find the really cool stuff is where the addictive fun of the series comes from. And I'm incredibly happy to report that this feeling is definitely still present and accounted for. In my playtime, I've already come across all sorts of incredible things. I've found bizarre, over-the-top pistols that can somehow function as sniper rifles, and long-range sniper rifles that can actually sap the life force from enemies. I've used guns that shoot weird fireworks and others that have elemental properties you can switch on the fly. The machine guns I've found are especially satisfying and can just rip through hordes of enemies. Just when I thought the developers had explored every possible variation for grenades and throwables, I've already seen some genuinely new stuff, and I have to say that's seriously impressive. When it comes to navigating the game's battlefields, I was struck by the design. Even though it's a large open world, whenever a story mission funnels you into a specific area, I feel it transforms into a really detailed and well thought out shooting arena. I've seen tons of exploding barrels of all different types and fun anchor points that you can use to swing or pull yourself up to higher ground with a grappling that I find incredibly satisfying to use. The movement mechanics, which include the ability to slide, dash side to side, jump, double jump, and even hover by holding a button, just feel good to me. I feel like you are truly in command during these shootouts and in these arenas. This is especially true with the ground pound move, which I find really satisfying. If you grapple up into the air, you can hold a button to slam down, and sometimes it will cause weaker enemies to just explode into bloody guts, which I think is just plain awesome. So far, I've experienced some really good, satisfying gore, great environmental destruction, and awesome explosions, and I've really been enjoying the world itself. Even though I feel like I've only experienced a small portion of it, I instantly realized just how staggeringly massive the open world truly is. I say this because while a lot of it is clearly designed for you to drive around in vehicles, I spent a good amount of time in the early vehicles and felt like I had seen a decent chunk of the map, but then I zoomed out and saw just how much territory I hadn't even come close to covering. Even within the small zones I've explored so far, I was impressed by the amount of variation. In my opinion, this variety is what helps make the game feel different and alive, just like a good open world should. I can say this because I didn't just stick to the main questline. I also went off the beaten path to take on some bounties I found in little safe houses you can claim for yourself, and I also stumbled upon various side quests out in the world. Of the handful of side quests I've engaged with, there was one in particular that I thought was going to be incredibly dry and repetitive, but it ended up concluding in a way that completely surprised me. So while I can't speak for every single side quest in the game, my early impression is that I've found quite a few that I genuinely liked, and that also, of course, gave me some great rewards in the end. Of course, as I mentioned, it's a new launch, and I've seen some technical issues pop up. If you take a look at the early Steam reviews, you'll see that people are pretty mixed, and it seems to me that the game is poorly optimized on PC. On the two systems I personally tested it on, I didn't run into too many issues, to be completely honest, but that's just my experience. I know that everybody's PC rig is different, and I've seen widespread reports of crashing and people struggling to get the game to run over 60 FPS without an incredibly powerful setup. So, I think that's definitely something you should keep in mind. What I will say is that I feel that Borderlands and its publisher have the resources to fix this and will likely do so pretty quickly, but you can never bet on that. And I also firmly believe that games should just launch in a better state than this. We've all talked about this a million times, and I feel like it's getting repetitive and frankly ridiculous at this point, so please keep that in mind before buying. As I said, I didn't have too many problems myself. I could tell it didn't launch fully optimized, and I had to really tweak the settings to get it working well for me. But once I got it dialed in, I was looting and shooting with minimal issues. However, the fact that there isn't a field of view FOV slider on the console versions is something I think is a real issue that needs to be updated. I say this because even when I was playing on PC, I'm not someone who usually gets motion sickness, but the game's default FOV did jam me up a little bit. I had to adjust it in the settings, and I'm glad that option was there for me, but I absolutely think console players should have that same option as well. For me, personally, my bigger issue with the game was actually the UI. I feel like the menus and other interface elements are a little underbaked. I know these games often have a hard time with UI because there's just so much data and information to display on the screen at once. You've got all these little RPG elements, stacking perks, and numbers everywhere, right? But I think in this case, the UI just looks and feels kind of flat to me. I don't think it does a good job of helping anything really stand out. I also had some issues where I would try to highlight certain things, and a window would pop up that would then cover other information I was also trying to look at simultaneously. So I would definitely like to see the developers make some tweaks and adjustments there. Other things, like the map, seem to work just fine for me. But yeah, I noticed some little things here and there, but nothing that really got in the way of me having fun playing for quite a few hours. Since the game became available yesterday on PC, I've played most of it solo, and I have to say I found the game interesting and engaging enough to enjoy by myself, which I think Borderlands games are usually pretty good at. However, I did have someone else jump into my game just to test out the co-op and see how the servers were holding up. I can report that we didn't have any issues, at least, which is always a relief at launch when you never know what to expect. But for me, it really comes back to the shooting and the core loop of getting new guns. You know, the Borderlands 101 formula. It seems to me that it's still working here, and it really pulled me in. On top of that, I feel that the big open world, the look of it, the way the details are rendered, and some of the color palettes feel like a bit of a continuation of what we saw in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. Even though that's a very different game set in a different time period with a completely different style, I just feel like it's an evolution of what they were doing there in some ways. I've already encountered some really interesting enemy types right from the get-go, and I've fought in some good boss battles just in my first few hours with the game. So I'm personally looking forward to seeing where the game really goes from here. The other thing I think we need to address, because a lot of people like to talk about it, is the humor. Humor is, of course, incredibly subjective, and I think some people don't realize that. I mean, look, some people like one flavor of humor, other people like another, and some people like a mix of everything in between. I know some people find the humor in Borderlands to be absolutely grating, while others can't get enough of it. I've seen a lot of talk about Borderlands 4 being toned down or scaling back from the way previous games in this series present themselves. But I would say to any Borderlands fans out there that it doesn't feel to me like the game has completely run away from its identity. There are still pretty frequent jokes and quips, and I have to be honest, a couple of them really hit with me and made me laugh. You may have seen the headlines going around about a location in the game named after the Embracer group, and I can confirm it's a trash island with a talking toilet. I thought it was a whole funny thing. So, I believe the game still has plenty of bits and still feels very much like Borderlands. If you're someone who still doesn't like that style of humor, I don't know what to tell you, but I'd say you should still give this one a try because it does feel a little different and a little more tuned. I'm just glad they didn't make the game gritty or grimdark or super serious like that first trailer seemed to suggest. In my mind, it's still Borderlands. It's still Claptrap doing a bunch of dumb shit. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing where this one goes because it seems like a pretty massive game. I could see people spending a lot of time in this one. I think you can very clearly see the depth of the weapon systems and the depth of the characters themselves. From what I can tell, each of the Vault Hunters technically has 3 action skills, with entire skill trees branching off within each of them. And even those 3 action skills themselves all have different variations, equipable items, and nuances to them. So when you combine that with the weapons, you get a ton of complexity, and when you add in the size of the world, the number of quests, and all the weird little things, busy work, and mysteries going on, it's just a lot of game. And I think that's a good thing. I just think they really need to figure out the technical stuff because, once again, where a lot of people are reporting issues. But that's where I'm at right now. and that's just my personal opinion, and now I want to hear yours down in the comments. So please make sure you're subscribed if you haven't already, but either way, let me know what you think about Borderlands 4 down in those comments. Clicking the like button really helps me out if you do, and I appreciate it. That's all I ask though. Thanks for watching.